They called it the seeding. That was the word the Vorth used, at least the closest translation the linguists could manage, before the linguists stopped being available for comment. A soft word, almost botanical, like something that belonged in a greenhouse or a prayer, not in the sky above 17 cities simultaneously going dark. Myra Callahan heard it for the first time through a wall. She was in Bay 4 of the Meridian Processing Center. Everyone called it the center, the way you call a prison a facility when you want to sleep at night. And the wall was the kind that only looks like drywall until you press your palm against it and feel the hum underneath, the low, persistent vibration that had been there since the Vorth anchored their first station 6 months ago. 6 months. She'd been in the center for 4 of them. The voice on the other side of the wall belonged to Overseer Nax. She could tell by the pauses. Nax was the only Vorth who paused mid-sentence, as though it was manually searching its translation matrices before each word, as though language was a tool it was still learning to hold. The others, the ones in white, the ones the humans on the inside had started calling the nurses, they didn't pause. They spoke in full, smooth sentences, and their intonations were so perfectly calibrated that it took Mara 3 weeks to understand they weren't human. The body language was wrong. Not wrong in a dramatic way, not like the old movie aliens who couldn't blink right. Wrong in the way a photograph is wrong, everything technically correct, nothing alive behind it. She pressed her back against the wall and stared at the ceiling. The ceiling was white. Everything in the center was white. The floors were a very slightly different shade of white, which she supposed was meant to indicate that they were floors, not walls. The beds were white. The paper gowns were white. The food, she used the word loosely, came in white containers. She had been here for 119 days. She had counted them by scratching a mark each morning on the underside of the bed frame with her fingernail. And she knew that if one of the nurses found the marks, they would replace the bed frame and she would lose count. So she also kept a second count in the only place the Vorth had never searched. The inside of her lower lip. A series of tiny pressure bites she refreshed each morning, a calendar written in bruise. She was 31 years old. She was a geologist. She had been in the field in southern Montana when the ships came, mapping a Cretaceous shale formation she'd been trying to get funding for since her 2nd year of grad school. She'd gotten the funding in February. The ships came in March. She thought about that sometimes, the cosmic comedy of it, the timing. A woman gets what she waited 6 years for, and the universe decides that's the moment to change the subject entirely. The wall vibrated again. Nax was giving instructions. She caught fragments. Transfer Cohort 7, the word that might have been ready and might have been ripened. The translation had never been reliable on that one, and the distinction, she'd come to understand, mattered enormously. Mara sat up. She was in a room with 11 other people. 8 women, 3 men, ranging from somewhere in their 20s to a silver-haired man named Fletcher who had to be pushing 65 and who, despite everything, still made small, dry jokes in the breakfast line that made the nurses look at him with that calibrated blankness they used instead of confusion. Fletcher had been a high school chemistry teacher in Boise, before the center. He was the one who'd first noticed the pattern in the selections, which cohorts went to the upper floors, which ones didn't come back down, the time of day correlation, the nutritional loading in the meals that preceded a transfer. Fletcher noticed things. It was, he said, the thing about spending 30 years with teenagers. You developed an eye for the moment something was about to go wrong. He was looking at her now from across the room. Cohort 7, Mara said quietly. Fletcher nodded once. There were 12 people in their room. There were exactly 12 people in every room on every floor of the center, which held by Mara's calculation, working from what she could see through the single narrow window and what she knew about institutional floor plans, somewhere between 400 and 500 humans. All of them delivered here in the weeks after the ships landed. All of them healthy. None of them the very old or the very young. The Vorith had been precise in their collection. The way you're precise when you're selecting for something specific. The way you don't grab the whole orchard, just the fruit at peak. That was the part that Mara kept returning to in the 119 days she'd been here, with the hum in the walls and the white light, and the nurses who moved between beds with their smooth non-expressions, and their instruments that she'd catalogued and described in detail on scraps of paper she kept tucked into the seam of her mattress. The instruments weren't painful. That was somehow the worst part. They were thorough and they were regular and they produced no pain whatsoever, which meant they weren't designed by something that understood pain as a deterrent. They were designed by something that didn't need to keep you afraid, something that didn't need your cooperation, something that just needed you to hold still. She'd figured out what they were taking in month 2. She was a geologist, not a biologist, but she'd had enough cross-disciplinary coursework to recognize the process once she'd had time to think about it. The harvest wasn't genetic material in any human reproductive sense. It was more fundamental than that. The Vorith were collecting something that humans produced biochemically, some compound or constellation of compounds that the instruments were periodically skimming from the bloodstream like a dairy farmer skims cream. Not enough to weaken the host, just enough to stockpile. The seeding. She understood the word differently now. They weren't farming humans for food or labor or experimentation. They were farming humans the way humans farmed bees, keeping the hive alive and functional, moving it from place to place as needed, maintaining conditions for maximum yield. 1 out of every 3 bites of food, the old documentary had said, exists because of pollination. She wondered what the Vorith statistic was. She wondered what the compound they were harvesting was essential for, on whatever scale of galactic ecology she could not yet perceive. She wondered if the bees ever knew. "Tonight," Fletcher said, still not looking at her. He'd learned early not to look at people when he was saying something important. The nurses watched eyes. "The transfer rotation is tonight. Cohort 7 is us. I know. The ones who go up don't come back with memories. I know that too." She'd watched it happen 3 times. People taken upstairs and returned 48 hours later, sitting in the common area with the same faces but with something removed from behind the eyes, not lobotomized, nothing so crude. More like a deep defragmentation. They could hold conversations. They answered questions, but they didn't ask any, not anymore. Whatever process occurred on the upper floors reset the human capacity for sustained inquiry, for the compounding of small observations into dangerous conclusions. It left the body and removed the archivist. She was not going to let them do that to her. She lay back down, she stared at the ceiling, she ran the plan again. It wasn't much of a plan. It had taken her 40 days to build it, and it relied on 3 things she couldn't fully control. That the service corridor behind the nutrition station was still accessible from the loose panel she'd found 3 weeks ago. That the elevator override code she'd decoded from watching the nurse's hand movements over 67 sequential observations was still valid. And that the thing Fletcher had built from components stripped from the examination instruments over the past 2 months would work the way he said it would. Fletcher had taught AP chemistry for 30 years. She chose to have faith. The lights dimmed at 2000 hours. That was the signal for the resident population to remain in their rooms. The nurses did their final rounds at 2100, checking vitals, administering what the residents had come to call the evening kindness, a mild sedating compound delivered through the air filtration, subtle enough that most people didn't realize they were being chemically eased towards sleep. Most people. Mara had spent 60 days building a tolerance. Small exposures during the day, controlled breathing patterns at night to minimize absorption. It had given her splitting headaches for the first 3 weeks, the kind that sat behind the eyes and pulsed, and she'd bitten the inside of her cheek hard enough to bleed to stay awake through them. And eventually the headaches had faded and she could lie still with her eyes closed, and her breathing deep and regular and her mind fully, quietly, stubbornly awake. She waited. 2000, 2100. The soft sound of the nurse moving down the corridor outside, the small click of the door panel as it checked their room, found 12 bodies breathing in the expected rhythms, moved on. She counted to 300. Then she sat up, pulled on the underlayer she'd never surrendered even when they'd offered her a warmer gown, and nudged Fletcher's cot with her foot. He was already awake. The loose panel in the nutrition station wall was 3 rooms down. Getting there required moving through a common area that had no camera blind spots. The Vorth were thorough about that, which meant not avoiding the cameras but accepting them, moving the way the air moved, slow and purposeless, and below the threshold of what the monitoring algorithms apparently flagged as intent. She'd watched how the nurses moved at night when they weren't performing for human observation. They moved differently, economically. She'd studied the contrast long enough to learn what their motion detection systems were calibrated to ignore. 2 minutes, 30 seconds. She and Fletcher were through the panel. The service corridor was utilitarian in a way the rest of the center was not: bare conduit, floor drains, the faint smell of something chemical that wasn't quite ammonia. Mara had her scraps of paper. She'd drawn the map from memory, and from what she could see through the narrow window in the nutrition room, the external geometry of the building, cross-referenced with the internal proportions, she'd paced out over 4 months of walking the permitted areas at precisely the same stride length, counting under her breath. She knew where the stairwell was. She knew which floor held the communication equipment, because she'd watched the nurses' reaction times to disturbances on different floors and found the anomaly. The 4th floor always responded 3 to 5 seconds faster than any other, which meant either the supervisory hub was there or the main relay was, and either would do. They moved through the service corridor without speaking. Mara thought about the bees. She'd seen the documentary once, years ago, on a laptop in a field camp in Montana, eating instant noodles and watching the migratory beekeepers drive their hives cross-country in the dark. Thousands of semi-trailers carrying their live cargo to wherever the flowers were. The bees didn't know what they were doing in any strategic sense. They just did what they'd evolved to do, and the result was that 1/3 of the human food supply existed. 1/3 of everything, just because small things did what their nature told them to do. She thought about what human nature had evolved to do, the stubbornness of it, the unreasonable, metabolically expensive, evolutionarily improbable fact of human curiosity, the drive not just to survive but to understand, to catalog, to take the small observations and stack them into towers that became knowledge, that became capability. Bees pollinated because flowers and bees had co-evolved over millions of years into a system of mutual benefit neither party had chosen. Humans built things, and then built things to build other things. They made fire and then made things that controlled fire and then made things that replaced fire. They wrote down what they learned. They passed it forward. They had the staggering audacity to look at a situation that was killing them and ask why before they ran. She stopped in front of the stairwell door. The nurse that was supposed to be on this level was 2 floors up. She'd timed it, 40-second window. "Ready?" she whispered. Fletcher pulled the device from his waistband. It was approximately the size and shape of a television remote, constructed from the internals of 3 examination instruments and a piezoelectric component he'd extracted from the underside of a bed sensor. It was, he'd explained, essentially a localized electromagnetic pulse emitter with a very specific frequency, tuned to the bioelectrical harmonic the Vorth instruments operated on. He'd figured out the harmonic in the same way Mara had figured out the elevator code. By watching, carefully, for 60 days, noting which instruments behaved differently in different electromagnetic environments, correlating the anomalies, deriving the carrier frequency through triangulation. "I want you to know," Fletcher said, "that there is approximately a 40% chance this does nothing at all." What's the other 60%? 20% it works as intended. 20% it does something else entirely. 20% it sets off every alarm in the building. Mara looked at him. I appreciate your honesty, she said, and opened the stairwell door. The stairwell was clean and bare and very white. They went up. On the fourth-floor landing, Mara pressed her ear against the door. Nothing. She eased it open. The fourth floor was different from the residential levels. The ceiling was higher. The light was a different quality, bluer, cooler, more like the light she'd noticed coming from under the door, the one time a nurse had escorted her up here for what they described as a calibration session, which had involved a chair, and a series of instruments and 30 minutes she couldn't fully account for afterward. She'd been in the residential wing since. She had been very careful not to be selected for another calibration. The relay station was at the end of the corridor. She could tell because it was the only door with no panel beside it, no keypad, no biometric reader. Just a recessed door with a specific electromagnetic seal. The Vorath weren't worried about human interference because humans, in their assessment, lacked the capacity for this kind of sustained strategic opposition, which was, Mara had come to understand, the central miscalculation. Not an arrogant miscalculation, an honest one. They'd done their research. They'd assessed human behavior patterns, determined the chemical sedation threshold, designed the monitoring systems around what humans had done historically in captivity. They'd built a very good system for managing a population of bees. They'd underestimated the beekeeper problem. Some humans, given enough time and enough sensory input and enough quiet, would reverse engineer the hive. Here, she said. Fletcher looked at the door. He looked at the device. He did the small grimace that was, she'd learned, his version of prayer. He pressed it against the door seal and triggered it. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the lights changed. Not all the lights, just a flicker, a momentary dip, like a power grid hiccup, and the seal on the door made a sound like a very small caught breath, and the door moved a centimeter inward. Mara pushed it open. The room beyond was filled with equipment she didn't have names for, didn't need names for, because what mattered wasn't the function of the individual components, but the aggregate function she'd inferred from 3 months of observation. This was a communications relay. The Vorath operated in a network. The centers weren't independent facilities managed in isolation. They were nodes, and nodes could be addressed from the inside. She'd learned their script. Not their language, she hadn't had access to enough of it for full acquisition, but the specific command strings she'd watched the nurses key in, day after day, during the broadcast windows. She'd memorized them in the same way she'd memorized geological formation names as a student, by writing them in the air with her finger in the dark, until they were no longer symbols but muscle memory. She sat down at the console. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this with a kind of remote scientific interest, the way she used to note tremors in the shale, relevant data point, do not let it change the plan. She started keying. The first sequence was the authentication string. She watched the display cycle. There was a moment of terrible nothing, and then it resolved into what she recognized as an acknowledgement state. Not confirmation that she'd been authenticated, but confirmation that the system was trying to authenticate her, which meant the authentication protocol was human-facing enough that her inputs were being processed. She entered the second sequence. The command she was trying to send was not complex, in the way that the most important things are rarely complex. She wasn't trying to destroy anything. She wasn't trying to call for help she didn't know was coming. She was trying to do the thing that had kept humans alive for 200,000 years in environments that should have killed them. She was trying to make noise. Meaningful, structured, information-rich noise. The specific command string she decoded was the one the nurses used for interfacility broadcasts. Routine operational updates pushed to all connected centers simultaneously. She was using it as a broadcasting address, and what she was broadcasting was everything she knew. The map of the center, the instrument frequencies, the sedation compound's apparent chemistry derived from how her body had responded to calibrated exposure, the transfer cycle timing, the bioelectrical harmonic Fletcher had derived, all of it encoded in the Vorith's own command structure, pushed out to every node in the network simultaneously. She was not sending a distress call. She was sending a manual. She was doing what humans did. She was writing it down. She was passing it forward. She pressed the final key. The display changed. She sat very still, looking at it, and then Fletcher made a sound behind her that she had never heard him make before. Not his dry humor sound, not his patient teacher sound, but something older and less managed. She turned around. There was a nurse in the doorway. It was standing with that perfect stillness they had, the absence of fidget that was one of the things that marked them, and it was looking at her with its calibrated face. And for the first time in 4 months of watching these things, she saw something in its expression that wasn't calibrated, something that had broken through the performance. She didn't have the cross-species vocabulary to name it with certainty, but the closest human analog she could find was the look on a person's face when they've made a calculation and arrived at a result that doesn't match the model. Not anger, something worse than anger. Recalibration. "You sent," it said in its smooth, translated voice, and then it stopped the way Nax stopped mid-sentence, searching. "You sent to all." "Yes," Mara said. "The others will now." "No," she said. "That's generally what happens when you give people information." She expected it to move. She was prepared for that, not that she had great options, but she was not going to be still about it. But the nurse didn't move. It stood in the doorway with its recalibrating expression, and made a sound she'd never heard a Vorith make. Not the smooth, translated speech, not the subsonic hum of facility communications, but something rough-edged and short. It took her a moment to identify it as the sound of something speaking in its own language without a translation layer, something speaking to itself. Then the building alarm went off. But it wasn't their alarm. She knew their alarm. She'd heard it twice in 4 months, both times for minor equipment malfunctions, a specific pitched wailing that the nurses responded to with a faster version of their usual walk. This was different. This was coming from outside, from above, from the sky. The nurse looked up. Myra looked up. Through the relay room's high narrow window, she could see light that hadn't been there a moment ago. Not the permanent amber aurora of the Vorith anchor station, which had been hanging over this part of the continent for 6 months like an artificial moon. This was different. This was many lights, small and fast and coming from a direction she'd trained herself to read after 35 years of looking at skies in field conditions. From the south, from below the station's operational altitude, from Earth. From inside the atmosphere. "Oh," she said. "There is a thing that happens when the information has been propagated, when the manual has been received and decoded and implemented by the people who needed it, when the hive has been understood." Mara had not known, when she pushed that final key, whether anyone had received her broadcast, whether the network had transmitted it to human ears or only Vorith ones, whether the 4 months of observation and derivation and small, persistent stubbornness had produced anything other than a record of a woman refusing to stop thinking. She knew now. The lights in the sky were not rescue ships, not in the way she'd have imagined rescue ships before the Vorith came, not military, not organized in any governmental sense, because there were no governments left in the original configuration. The lights were varied. Some of them were clearly repurposed commercial aircraft, their running lights wrong for combat but present, cutting through the dark. Some of them were things she didn't recognize, shapes that suggested engineering done fast and wrong and enthusiastically, the way humans engineer when they have a specific problem and limited time, and the full weight of their unreasonable ingenuity pressing against both. Some of them were just lights without visible origin, which meant either she was looking at things too small to see at this altitude, or things that hadn't been designed to look like any category she had a name for. What they had in common was trajectory, all of them coming in at the same vector, all of them aimed at the anchor station. The nurse made the rough, untranslated sound again, longer this time. More of them. She could hear voices in the corridor now. The normally smooth intervorath communication fractured into something faster and less composed. Whatever she had sent to the network had done something more than inform. It had arrived in the hands of people who knew what to do with it. And those people had, in the way of people who have been waiting a very long time in the dark for one piece of the puzzle they were missing, immediately done something extremely human about it. She thought about the documentary again. The beekeeper driving his hives across the country in the dead of night, truck headlights cutting through the dark, carrying something essential to something that needed it. The bees not knowing, the bees just doing what their nature told them to do, the bees producing what they produced because millions of years of evolution had made them into exactly this. Small things that moved through the world, making it possible for larger things to live. She thought about the seeding, the Vorath's soft word, their warm, patient, efficient system for maintaining a population of useful organisms. She thought about the thing they hadn't modeled, the thing no system designed for bees would model, because bees didn't do it. Bees didn't burn down the hive. Fletcher was beside her. He had picked up one of the instruments from the relay console, not as a weapon, but she recognized the look on his face. He was cataloging it. He was going to figure out what it did. He would not stop trying to figure out what it did until he understood it, and then he would figure out how to use it, and then he would find the next thing he didn't understand and start again. He would do this until he was dead or until there was nothing left that he didn't understand, and Mara was willing to bet that the former would come first, and that he was completely fine with that. "Service elevator," she said. "We need to get to the ground floor. Everyone in this building needs to be out before." The anchor station's hum changed pitch. She'd been hearing that hum for 6 months. She knew every modulation of it, the way you know every sound a building makes when you've lived in it long enough. The pitch change was not maintenance. It was not a routine adjustment. It was the sound of a system that was being asked to do too many things at once, the frequency wobble of overload, the specific acoustic signature of something very large encountering unexpected resistance. Before that, she finished. They ran. The corridor was chaos in the Vorath sense, not human chaos, not shouting and collision and the particular beautiful disorder of frightened people, but the breakdown of smooth performance, nurses moving too fast and not precisely enough, the calibration slipping, the thing behind the faces showing through because there wasn't time anymore to manage the presentation. She had 4 months of studying these things, and she used all of it in the 40 seconds it took to cross from the relay room to the elevator, reading their movements the way she read rock formations, looking for the stress lines, the pressure points, the places where the structure would give. She hit the elevator override with the code she'd spent 60 days decoding. The elevator opened. She turned to Fletcher. "Wake everyone you can, tell them." "I know what to tell them," he said. He was already moving toward the stairwell. He turned back once briefly with his dry teacher's look. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm glad you counted the days." "Go," she said. The elevator descended. On every floor she passed, she could hear it. The sounds of 400 and some humans waking from the evening kindness earlier than the sedation protocol intended. The sounds of people who were confused and frightened and had been docile for too long and were finding, as humans find when the chemistry clears and the information arrives, that docility is a condition, not a character trait. She could hear Fletcher's voice 2 floors up, calm and pedagogical, explaining with the patient precision of a man who had spent his life making complicated things comprehensible to people who didn't yet have the vocabulary for them. She reached the ground floor. The main doors were locked by electromagnetic seal, the same technology as the relay room, and she'd suspected this and prepared for it. She'd kept the device Fletcher had built, and she pressed it against the door panel, and this time it worked on the first attempt, because Fletcher had known the first attempt in the relay room was a calibration, and had adjusted accordingly, because that was what he did. The doors opened. The night outside was not the night she'd last seen 4 months ago. The sky was wrong. The anchor station was still there. She could see it overhead, the familiar amber oval, but it was flickering now, its light inconsistent, and around it the many lights of the things that had come from the south were doing complicated things that she didn't have the aerospace vocabulary to describe, but which her geologist's eye read as the activity around a fault line just before it gives. Stress. Release. The irresistible logic of accumulated pressure. She walked out. The air hit her like a physical thing, cold and real and full of the smell of the plains, the dry grass smell, the particular mineral sharpness of the Montana night that she had last breathed in a field camp, mapping a Cretaceous shale formation, before the world changed its subject. She stopped walking and just stood there for a moment with her face up and her eyes closed and breathed it in, the whole stupid, enormous reality of being outside, and let herself have that moment, because she'd earned it, and because she didn't know how many moments she had left, and she was, at her core, someone who believed in paying attention to good data. Then she opened her eyes and got to work. The humans coming out of the center behind her were disoriented and underdressed, and some of them were crying, and some of them were looking at the sky with an expression she recognized, because she'd worn it herself at the beginning, the expression of people who have been told via irrefutable evidence that the scale of the universe is different from what they'd assumed. She moved among them. She had been doing this for 4 months in small ways, the quiet word at breakfast, the details slipped into conversation, the careful maintenance of the network of people who were paying attention, who were building the map of what was happening and what could be done about it. She did it more overtly now, because overt was what the situation called for. She sent the ones who could run east, toward the tree line a kilometer away. She sent the ones who couldn't toward the building's exterior wall, where the ground floor structure would provide some cover. She found the people she knew, the ones who had been tracking with her, keeping their own counts, hoarding their own observations, and she gave each of them a specific task, because specific tasks were what humans needed when they were frightened. Not comfort, not reassurance, something to do with their hands and their minds, something that connected their individual capability to a larger function, something that made them feel correctly that they were part of the mechanism. Above her the anchor station flickered again, flickered. A sound came from it that she felt in her sternum, not the low chronic hum of operation but something sharper, a harmonic she hadn't heard before, and she thought about Fletcher's device and the bioelectrical frequency and the information she'd sent through the network. And she thought about what it meant if the people who'd received that information had found uses for it she hadn't anticipated, which was the thing about propagating information. You couldn't control what people built with it. And that was not a bug. She was about 300 meters from the building when the sky cracked. Not the station. The sky around the station. The Vorith anchor stations operated via a form of spatial compression that the physicists on the outside had been working on for 6 months and hadn't fully characterized. And when the compression field failed, it didn't fail like a machine fails, didn't simply stop. It expanded. The space that had been compressed reasserted itself with the enthusiasm of something that had been held under pressure, a geological principle she knew well, the springback of stressed material, and the light was extraordinary. She would think about that word later, extraordinary, a word built from ordinary, a word that meant exceeding the expected range. She stood in it with her face up. The station broke apart in the upper atmosphere with a sound that arrived 15 seconds after the light, the way thunder arrives after lightning, the delay calculated by distance and the speed of sound in air, and she could have told you the distance from that delay if she wanted to. She was that kind of person. She was exactly that kind of person. She had been in a room with white walls for 4 months, and she had come out the same person she went in, which was the thing the Vorith had not modeled, the assumption that had failed at the root. That captivity changes what a human is. It doesn't, that was the answer. It really categorically, stubbornly doesn't. What captivity does, what any pressure does, is compress. And compressed things, when the compression releases, expand with the full force of everything that was in them before. The human population of the Meridian Processing Center had been managed for 4 months. Their chemistry had been regulated. Their movement had been restricted. Their information environment had been controlled. And in those 4 months, in the white rooms and the white light and the morning counts and the evening kindness, they had spent every available moment being exactly what they were. Curious, stubborn, cataloging, planning, passing things forward. The anchor station's debris was still falling, controlled, the fragments burning in the upper atmosphere into harmless light, when she heard someone behind her say her name. She turned. There were people coming across the field from the eastern tree line, not the center's population, who were still gathered near the building. These were people from outside, armed with things she didn't recognize and things she did, carrying equipment she'd never seen, and wearing the expressions of people who had been in the field for a long time and had found what they came for. They moved in a formation that wasn't military, but had the purposefulness of people who'd figured out their own structure from first principles, which was the kind of organization that emerged when the original organizations were no longer available, and humans had to build new ones from scratch. A woman in front, 30-ish, short dark hair and a scar along her jaw that was healed but recent. She walked to Mara and stopped. "You're the source signal," she said. "Not a question." "I sent what I had," Mara said. "You sent enough." The woman, she gave her name later, for now she was just the woman from the tree line, looked at the station debris still tracing orange lines across the sky, then back at Mara with the direct evaluating look of someone who was adding Mara to a mental model and adjusting the model to fit. "There are 14 other centers. We've hit 6 in the last 3 hours. The relay network," Mara said, "if you use the broadcast address I included." "We did. 7 of the other centers sent their own signals after yours came through. We're triangulating the remaining nodes." The woman paused. "How did you derive the harmonic frequency?" Mara looked at her. Then she looked back at the building, where she could see Fletcher being helped across the field by 2 of the younger residents. He was using what appeared to be a Vorith instrument as a walking stick. He was explaining something to the person helping him. He had not stopped explaining. "Chemistry teacher," Mara said. "Boise. He figured it out from first principles over about 8 weeks. The woman from the tree line considered this. "We have people who have been working on that frequency for 6 months. He had fewer distractions." The woman made a sound, not quite a laugh, something adjacent to it, the compressed version of a laugh, what happens to a laugh when the person has been in the field too long to fully produce one. "The centers are going to be cleared. The ones that are left, we have the coordinates, we have the harmonic, we have your relay map." She looked at Mara more directly. "What I don't have is someone who's been on the inside of the network for 4 months. Mara looked at her scraps of paper. She'd carried them all the way down from the residential floor. 119 days of observation, compressed into a handful of creased sheets covered in small, careful handwriting. She thought about geological survey reports, the careful inventory of what was in the ground, the exact notation that let someone else come later and know what they were dealing with. "I'll need a real notebook," Mara said. "Done. And someone who can cross-reference my biochem observations with an actual biologist. My training is geology." "We have people." "And coffee," she said. "Real coffee, not whatever they were giving us." The woman from the tree line almost laughed again. This time it made it all the way. "Done," she said. "Done, done, and absolutely done." The sky was clearing. The debris of the anchor station was just streaks now, fading. The Montana plain stretched out in every direction, enormous and dark and smelling of itself, and above it the stars were becoming visible again as the amber aurora of the Vorith occupation dimmed and failed, the old stars coming back one by one like the lights of a city coming back on after a blackout, each one small and steady and very far away, each one having been there all along. Mara Callahan stood in a field in Montana and breathed the real air, and looked up at the real stars, and held her 119 days of notes against her chest. Tomorrow she would start writing it down properly. All of it. Every observation, every derivation, everything she'd learned in the white room with the white light. She would write it down and pass it forward, the way people pass things forward, the way the species had passed things forward for 200,000 years, not because there was a plan, not because someone had designed the process, but because that was what they did when you put them somewhere and told them to hold still. They noticed things. They wrote them down. They passed them forward. The Vorith had come to seed the earth, to tend their hive, to harvest, carefully, periodically, just enough that the population would never notice, just enough that the system would sustain itself indefinitely. They had not understood what they were farming. Bees don't know what pollination is. They carry what they carry because they evolved to, and the world grows because of it, and they go on. Humans know exactly what they're doing. That was the variable. That was the thing no system built to manage bees would ever account for. In the distance over the eastern horizon where the tree line thinned toward open sky, she could see more lights. Not Vorith, not anchor stations. Moving fast and purposeful through the dark, heading north toward the next set of coordinates. Carrying in their cargo holds the harmonic frequency and the relay map, and the accumulated knowledge of 4 months in a white room with a woman who would not stop counting days. She watched them go. She breathed. She started composing the first line of the report in her head. It began, as all good reports begin, with the date. She wrote the report over 3 days in a tent at the edge of a field camp that had been set up in the shelter of the same tree line, where the rescue team had emerged from the dark. The camp was utilitarian in the way of things built fast for function, mismatched equipment, tarpaulins strung between vehicles that were themselves mismatched, the improvised infrastructure of people who had been operating for months without supply lines, and had learned to build what they needed from what was available. She found it more beautiful than anything she'd seen in the center. On the first morning she was handed a proper notebook, actual paper, spiral-bound, the cover slightly water-damaged from field storage, and a pen, and a mug of coffee that was strong enough to be considered a chemical hazard. She sat outside the tent in the early light with the notebook open on her knee and the coffee going cold beside her, and she wrote without stopping for 4 hours, the way she used to write field notes in Montana. Direct, precise, everything recorded in the order it was observed, with marginal annotations for cross-reference and uncertainty flags where her inference outran her data. The biologist came on the second day. Her name was Soo Jin Park, and she had spent the last 5 months in a research facility in what had been the suburbs of Seoul working on samples that had been smuggled out of a processing center by a nurse who turned out to be, against all probability, the wrong kind of nurse, a human infiltrator. A person who had spent 6 months learning to move the way they moved and speak the way they spoke, and had gotten very deep into the system before making her exit with a coat lining full of purloined instruments. Park was compact and methodical, and had the particular focus of someone who had been pointed at a problem for so long that the problem had become the entire shape of her world. And she read Mara's biochemistry observations with her lower lip, pulled between her teeth, and made sounds in her throat that Mara couldn't fully interpret, but which sounded like confirmation. "The compound they're harvesting," Park said, eventually. She was sitting cross-legged on a folding chair with Mara's notebook in her lap and her own notebook open beside it, and a second mug of the tactical-grade coffee going equally cold. It's not a single compound. It's a cascade product. The thing you observe being skimmed from the bloodstream is what happens when three separate human biochemical processes interact at a specific threshold. She stopped. She looked at her own notes and then at Mara's, and then at the sky in the specific way of someone arriving at a conclusion they've been approaching for a long time. Do you know what they're using it for? No, Mara said. I know it's not food. I know it's not reproductive. I know it's not for any process that has a direct anatomical consequence in humans because the people who were harvested remained healthy and returned to normal baseline function between extractions. My best guess is it's an industrial compound of some kind, something they need for their own technology. Park nodded slowly. It's a catalytic compound, she said. From what I can reconstruct, and I want to be clear that this is 6 months of working from incomplete samples under extremely non-ideal conditions, it's something that accelerates a specific class of chemical reaction. Not unique to humans, but produced in this specific form only by human biochemistry, and in quantities that scale with cognitive and emotional activity. The more, she stopped again. The more engaged the population, the higher the yield. Mara looked at her. The centers weren't suppressing human cognitive function, Park said. They were calibrating it. The mild sedation, the restricted information environment, they were trying to maintain a specific activity level. Enough to keep production going, not so much that the hosts experience stress responses that would alter the compound's chemical profile. She paused. Like a controlled fermentation. You want the process active, you just don't want it to run too hot. Myra thought about that for a long moment. So when we were planning, she said, when we were observing and deriving and building things in secret, you were producing elevated yields, Park said. Substantially elevated. The instruments they were using weren't sophisticated enough to filter for the activity causing it. They were just reading the product. We were paying them back for every second of that, Mara said. Park looked at her. Then she made the same sound the woman from the tree line had made, the almost laugh, the compressed version. I hadn't thought of it that way, but yes. Fletcher arrived at the camp on the afternoon of the second day, having been evacuated from the center along with the rest of the population, and routed through 2 intermediate staging points. He came into the tent with his dry expression intact and his alien instrument tucked under his arm, and he sat down across from Mara and accepted the tactical coffee with appropriate solemnity and looked at her report on the table between them. I've been thinking about the frequency derivation, he said. Of course you have. There's a secondary harmonic I didn't have time to test. The device we built was tuned for the primary. That's why the door took 2 attempts. The second attempt was me correcting for the resonance shift at the seal material boundary. But if the secondary harmonic is a factor, then there may be a class of Vorath communications equipment that the primary won't affect. Can you build for the secondary? He turned the alien instrument over in his hands. It was a reassuring gesture, not the fumbling of unfamiliarity, but the deliberate handling of someone who had already disassembled the thing mentally and was now walking through the reassembly. Given 3 days and a decent multimeter, he said, yes. Myra pushed her notebook toward him. Then you'd better get started, she said. The camp operated in a rhythm that she recognized within a few hours as the natural rhythm of people who had been building something under pressure for a long time. Intense, focused work, punctuated by meals that people ate fast and in groups, punctuated by brief, abrupt sleep that ended when the mind was done rather than when the body had finished recovering. She fell into the rhythm easily because she'd lived it in field work, and because the work itself had the quality she'd always found most sustaining. It was cumulative. Each thing learned was a foundation. Each calculation confirmed was a step. The information moved between people in the camp with the efficiency of a system that had learned not to hoard it, had learned that the distribution was itself the mechanism, that the strength of the network was the network. She thought about the bees again. She kept thinking about the bees. The migratory beekeepers drove their hives in the dark because the bees were quieter at night, less likely to swarm, less likely to be disrupted by temperature changes, less likely to fight. The beekeeper understood the bees well enough to know when to move them and when to let them work. The Vorith, she thought, had understood humans about as well as a person who had read extensively about bees without ever keeping any, technically accurate at the population level, completely blind to the things that happened at the level of the individual hive, the specific colony, the particular swarm that had encountered an unusual environment and adapted in ways the textbook hadn't covered. The textbook didn't cover Fletcher. The textbook didn't cover the woman from the tree line, whose name was Adrienne Vasquez, and who had been a structural engineer before the ships came, and who had spent 5 months reverse engineering Vorith field technology with a team of 11 people in a bunker in New Mexico, and who was currently coordinating the clearance of the remaining centers with the calm precision of someone who had built a very clear model of the problem and was now executing against it. The textbook didn't cover Park, who had worked from stolen samples in a Seoul basement for 5 months and arrived at conclusions about the harvested compound that were going to reshape the entire strategic picture. The textbook didn't cover any of them because the textbook was designed to model a population, and what had happened was not a population behavior. It was the specific, irreducible, stubbornly individual behavior of particular people who had been given a particular set of conditions and had responded with the full weight of who they specifically were. On the third morning, Vasquez came to find her. Mara was standing outside the tent in the early light with the last page of her report, reviewing it with the critical eye she'd developed over 15 years of submitting field reports to people who would catch every error. The report was 4 pages of tightly written notes, plus 2 pages of diagrams, plus a 3-page appendix cross-referencing her biochemistry observations with Park's compound analysis. It was the most thorough document she'd produced in 5 years of geology, and she was aware of the irony that she'd produced it about an alien hive system rather than a Cretaceous shale formation. "Last center was cleared 6 hours ago," Vasquez said. Myra looked up. 14 centers, 14 cleared. Population recovery is ongoing. We're looking at an overall total somewhere around 6,000 people. Vasquez paused. The anchor stations are down. All of them. The frequency data from your broadcast and the harmonic work your chemistry teacher did, it's been implemented across all active teams. Fletcher, Mara said. What? His name is Fletcher, not your chemistry teacher. Vasquez looked at her steadily. Fletcher, she said, with something in her voice that wasn't quite apology but was in that neighborhood. He's been asked to consult with the engineering team. He declined until he finishes the secondary harmonic device. He said, she paused, he said he doesn't do things out of order. That sounds right. Vasquez looked at the sky. The Montana morning was clear and cold and huge, the horizon enormous, the kind of sky that made you feel the curvature of the earth. The stations are down, she said again, but they're not gone. There are still 3 Vorith vessels in outer system orbit. They haven't moved in 18 hours. Mara felt the geological instinct fire, the same instinct that read the stillness before a formation shifted. They're reassessing, she said. That's our read too. Vasquez looked at her directly. They came here to farm a resource. They lost that farm. They have enough data now to know why. She paused. The question is whether they come back with a different approach or whether they write this planet off as unprofitable. What's the calculation on the compound? Mara asked. How essential is it? What Park found about the catalytic function? It's significant but not unique. Park is working on that now. There are other sources in the galaxy, just not as prolific or as chemically consistent as humans produce. Which means the cost-benefit analysis of attempting a second operation here may or may not pencil out for them, depending on factors we can't access. We should make sure it doesn't pencil out, Mara said. Vasquez almost smiled. Not quite. That, she said, is the conversation I came to have. They sat down on two folding chairs outside the tent with the morning light coming in flat and clean across the plain, and Mara finished her coffee and turned to a new page in the notebook, and they started to work. The report she'd written over 3 days in the field camp was transmitted through every available communication channel later that afternoon, not to the Vorath, not as a signal, but to every human research group and resistance network that Vasquez's team was in contact with. The relay architecture Mara had mapped from the inside was now understood well enough to be repurposed. The Vorath's own network, turned around and used by the very population it had been designed to manage. They used it the way they used everything. The way people who write things down use everything, carefully, thoroughly, for far longer than the original architects intended. In the outer system, the 3 Vorath vessels held their positions for another 31 hours. Then they moved not toward Earth, not into an approach vector, but out, accelerating on a trajectory that the human tracking teams parsed over the following days as departure. Not retreat, not in any tactical sense, simply a recalculation. A resource acquisition mission encountering a variable not in the model, resolving to disengage and report. Mara was in the field camp when the departure was confirmed. She was sitting outside in the afternoon light with the notebook in her lap and a fresh mug of the tactical coffee beside her, and she was reviewing Park's latest update on the compound analysis. And when Vasquez came to tell her, she looked up from the page and nodded once and looked back down. She had 3 more pages of analysis to get through before dark. She wanted to cross-reference the extraction instrument frequency data with the secondary harmonic Fletcher had finished building for. She wanted to write up the calibration findings from the residential floor monitoring systems while the specifics were still fresh. She wanted to make sure the maps she'd paced out in the center, the ones she'd rebuilt from memory, cross-referenced with the external geometry she'd observed through the narrow window, were transcribed accurately before the memory softened. Vasquez stood there for a moment. "They're gone," she said. "For now," Mara said. "For now," Vasquez agreed. "We have what we know," Mara said. "We need to know more before they come back." "Yes." "Then let's get back to work." Vasquez went back to the command tent. Fletcher, 2 tents down, could be heard explaining something in his patient classroom voice to whoever was in there with him. Park was somewhere in the camp, running her 4th iteration of the compound reconstruction. 300 meters to the east, in what had been the main recovery tent, and was now converting to a research space. 6,000 people who had come out of the centers were doing the thing that humans do when the immediate emergency has passed, and they have information and energy, and the bottomless, unreasonable human conviction that understanding the thing that almost killed them is more important than simply being glad it didn't. They were asking questions. They were writing things down. They were passing things forward. The Montana plain stretched out enormous and ordinary and real, under a sky that was just a sky again, and Mara Callahan turned to the next page in the notebook and began.